All right. So I'll do a quick video. This is my sort of my process for doing cinematic sound design. Kind of showcasing how I fit FilterFreak into that. Because I had some interest in that. So this first sound that I'm gonna kind of show is if I take away the effects and get rid of that. It's just one of the boom black powder sounds. So it sounds like this. Right. All I got here is I had an EQ, and this is probably just a limiter. Yeah, I just have a safety limiter on. And yeah, so it's pretty standard sound. You can hear it a lot. And so this is the effects chain that I'm using, and it looks kind of crazy. But really all it is, it's adding motion and mitigating noise is really kind of the name of the game when it comes to cinematic sounds, at least as far as what I found works for me. And so all of the racks that I'm going to show, I'm not going to get too in detail with further on, but I'll kind of work my way through this. So the first thing is just some Z noise. And all this is really doing, it's really subtle, barely doing anything. And probably pump up the threshold a little bit. But it's just kind of getting rid of some of the super, super high end. So if I... Right, so just a little tiny bit of noise, like probably negligible, considering I'm about to throw in a whole bunch of effects, but just I like to do it. So this next one, I'm just going to show you what it looks like real quick. Right, so it's 2 notch filters, and they're kind of going against each other. So what that does is they kind of like meet in one point. Which is kind of an interesting thing. And I have the mix halfway down, probably around 40-ish%. If I were to crank that up, it's kind of a drastic, like, right. So it's just adding a lot of extra motion that's hard to get. Like you could draw that in with EQ, but it's just kind of like tedious to do that. So it's nice to have some presets and stuff that you can just kind of throw on and do that. Next is some distortion. This has been my go-to distortion lately. Oop. And right, so really adding some top end, a little bit of grit, mangling the transient a good bit. And the next sound I have here is the first FilterFreak, or I guess this is the second one. Well, the first FilterFreak one of only one, I guess. But yeah, so the big thing here is setting FilterFreaks is it's really source dependent. So this took a little bit of fine tuning to do. But normally with impact sounds, I would keep the attack closer to like 10 to 50-ish, 50 maybe 100 at the most. But I actually really liked it around like it was like 260-ish. Because it adds a little bit of the sweep in, and I'm gonna add it adds some motion to the transient itself, and then I'm gonna kind of make up for the fact that you're not hearing a lot of the transient. But it sounds like this right now. Right, we hear it like, and right versus. And the cool thing about that is I can then add some transient back in with transient designers. So, oop. Right. So now the transient almost feels like it's kind of like pushed back a little bit because we're whooshing kind of into something, and then the transient master is going to grab onto it and kind of punch it up. But so kind of how I set this is, well, also, I guess I'll unmute this sound and kind of give you example like what this is. So this is a quick little, it's just this same sound, but reversed, down tuned a little bit, and then faded in with, it's, pulled back about 6 dB, right? And just sort of adds a little extra motion to, it'll open and close the filter, as well as just kind of setting yourself up. Like a lot of, you know, cinematic hits will have that sort of whoosh in and then the kind of the break, because you want the transient to punch. So you can go right, and that's just kind of all this is. And I kind of set the filter attack and release depending on this included, right? So this is not gonna, because of the release is so long, the filter is actually not gonna close all the way. And yeah, so the next thing again is, you know, I've added some noise from the distortion. The FilterFreak's adding a little bit. Oh, and I guess also I'm on the dirt mode. I actually usually have it on the op amp mode. I usually prefer that. Ooh. Oh, let me do it without that real quick. Yeah, I like the op amp better. The dirt's nice if you're actually trying to get dirt, but I prefer the sound of the black box and stuff. So I try to get my dirt through that. Yeah, and so the next one is, again, we're trying to mitigate noise. And this is a pretty extreme example of that. So one of the things that I like about cinematic hits is you don't have to be very literal about it. They can be kind of weird. And one of the things that I really like doing is kind of just sucking all of the noise out of sounds. And you can do that pretty well with M ratio MB. It does get pretty artifacty. But when cinematics come, especially if you're in like sort of a more sci-fi world and you're not trying to be super organic, like drums and gunshots and stuff like that, you can get away with a lot by just ripping out the noise and then distorting what's left. And that's kind of what we're gonna do here. So I have the noise ratio up and gain down and then some tonal added. So it kind of turns it from this to... Right, so you're not getting as much high end, you're not getting as much hiss, but you're adding, like, it's emphasizing some harmonics in the mid register and the high register. They kind of pop out of the mix a little bit more. A little bit of R bass, nothing really crazy there. And then some transmod, and the cool thing about transmod is you can get a lot of high end back by overdriving the transient. And then depending on where you have your overshoot, this is basically how long of a transient it's going to let you kind of push. Right, so now we have a lot more transient back just from... Right. And then some multi-band compression. I really like cranking the limiter into cinematic sounds. It really brings out some harmonic stuff. All right, that thing is slammed. Right. A little bit of EQ, and this is just a safety limiter, right? And so one of the cool things is, and hopefully I actually just recorded this video, but I realized the audio levels were pretty off. So what you can do then you can render this, right? And the cool thing about all this movement that we're adding, right, is that we can re-add movement back to the sound, right? So if I just reverse the sound, bring it back in, now we have this. Right, which is kind of a cool sound. It's a little harsh on the top end. Like if I was doing this for real, I'd adjust. But then I can add that. You know, what happens if I reverse this? Let me bring this stuff over here. I guess I can just mute that and put it somewhere. Right, you know, we're getting into like some super harsh stuff, but if I bring it down super far, right, like that first one was kind of cool. You know, it's super harsh, right? Like, but the cool thing is now I have this sound I could bring into RX, I could decrackle it, I could, attenuate some of that harshness, and I could do this sort of thing. And now I have a cool little whoosh in that I could maybe add to our explosion, right? And then, like, what is this? Well, what does this sound like without processing? Yeah, that's kind of cool. I don't know, it's nothing crazy, but... All right, now we have that sort of like... sort of right after the end of the training. And this is kind of how I like to build a lot of my cinematic textures, right? So I'll get those out of the way. And I guess this is another thing is that all these processing chains, right? They're going to react very differently depending on what you throw into them. So this right here is just another Canon shot from the same library, but it's a slightly more distant one, so it's not quite as bright, not quite as sharp. But I really liked the way that the tails were emphasized in this, and it kind of adds some cool movement. Right, so, you know, we could record that. I really like how it kind of like flips in the stereo spectrum. So, you know, we could add this to our like impact. Right, now we're starting to kind of get somewhere. So another thing that I like doing is, so I have these tiger growls here. And I think FilterFreak and tiger growls, just animal growls in general, work really well for cinematic stuff. It just adds a lot of cool texture. So I really like the way it kind of has this like throaty, thumpy sort of thing. Like it sounds like the chest or the tongue is just like slapping back and forth or something. Or right. And so I have a very similar chain here. But one of the things that I did was I narrowed the stereo width and I added some flange just to widen it back out because I didn't like how it was kind of lopsided. You can see like here is this, is that the right channel is a little bit louder than the left and whatnot. And then I'm sort of like just rearranging some of these things, right? So one of the cool things about these chains is that you can kind of just piecemeal things together and move things around. But throwing everything back on, like now we have something like this. Right. And again, yeah, the cool thing about this is that like you can kind of like just kind of like start throwing things. Like what if I wanted to distort it more? Right. Nope. That's kind of cool. Let's bring the filter down more. Right. And so one of the cool things you can do is if you want to add a little extra motion, right now I have some resonance mod. So the same way where like, let's say, you know, if I had no resonance mod, right, this shape is never going to change. But if I loop this, right, and slowly bring up the resonance mod, you're going to see sort of a peak start to form, right? Right. And usually, like, unless you're really going for that super modulated, super filtery, I'm usually not, I don't go too hard with that. But if like you add like somewhere around like 5 to 10, you can kind of emphasize the pitch of those frequencies as it sweeps through it, which is kind of nice without being so obvious, like it's a filter, right? Like all of a sudden it just starts to sound like a 303 or something like that if you add too much resonance. And then just a quick last demonstration is basically one of the cool things is that like you can have all these things, and then if you want to add motion, right, and you have a longer sound, if you add Dopplers, right, Doppler's the perfect match to a FilterFreak, because you're adding this like you're adding this this volume curve essentially, right, that the FilterFreak can then react to, right? So if I mute this, right, and I'll just loop this area. Oop. Right. If I add it back and then we take a look at this Doppler. right? And then we get like kind of a cool sort of texture, right? Now we have like some sort of spaceship or like a sci-fi sword or something like that kind of texture that we can layer onto something that's a little bit more real. And yeah, also, you know, I realized anytime you add Z noise, it's going to add latency. So that's why, like, if you look at the Doppler, when you hear it, it's not the same thing that you're seeing, right? So it passes, then we hear it. So just so you know, if you see that, it looks a little weird. Yeah, and that's basically kind of how I use FilterFreak and kind of create cinematic textures, right? I guess like I could also, oh, that's why it was sounding weird. Right. So, you know, I could then take that sound, right, layer that in with our thing, cut it when we are supposed to cut it. You know. All right, now we have kind of a cool sound. So yeah, you know, I can mute those, but right. And that's kind of like how I like to riff on this. And then I guess for a last thing is if you have something like a sound miner or some other environment that you can do this in, I do almost all this work in Sound Miner's VST rack, and what I'll do is I'll record and re-record and re-record, sort of like how you know, I made this sound right here where I sort of like looped it over and over through the same chain. I'll do that a lot in VST rack, and I'll basically generate a whole bunch of content, and that way I don't have to bog down my sessions with these like monster FX chains, and then I can always have those chains at my fingertips whenever I need to recall them. So just a little workflow thing. And then it's also sort of like set it and forget it, right? Once I have the source, I don't have to think about, oh, if I like move it 10 hertz higher, right, it's gonna like, I've sort of made the decision and I have to live with it, which is helpful for just getting work done faster, right? Instead of like sweating all the fine details of things. So yeah, that's sort of all I got. If you have any questions, let me know. I hope this helps. Thanks.